want to welcome you back to week three, where we're talking about releasing shame. And we're going to be talking this week about how to unmask some of the hidden driver behind some of our destructive behaviors. And in fact, in this session, we're going to talk about some warning signs that are indicative that you might be carrying shame. Let me start by sharing a story of an experience that I had. So, in the Bible, there is a particular city that's mentioned in Joshua chapter 3, verse 1. And the name of this city is interesting because if you're preaching through this passage and you mispronounce this particular city's name, if you say it too slow, it can sound like a curse word. All right, so it's in Joshua chapter 3, verse 1, and it says, early in the morning, Joshua and all the Israelites set out from a place called Shittim and went to Jordan. Well, as you can imagine, that word has a four-letter word in it. And on the day that I was preaching through this passage, I had been nervous about it all week because during my going through my sermon rehearsing, I was like, "This, I'm not saying this word right." Well, I get to my sermon and I get to this word, and my enunciation failed me. And I said it a little too slowly, and it basically sounded like I just yelled a four-letter word at the congregation. And so I tried to correct myself, but then it get worse because every time I tried to correct myself, I pronounced it even more strongly, and it was, man, it was a mess. Like, it ended up sounding like I was cursing the congregation. Well, of course, this created a ripple effect in my preaching because for the next few moments, man, I was just stumbling through the whole sermon. And I remember thinking it was a humorous moment, but it was a little embarrassing, right? It was a little bit of embarrassing. In fact, let me use this story as an example of what shame is. So, the embarrassment that I felt in that moment, in that sermon, was a response to something that is morally neutral, right? It wasn't good, wasn't bad, but what happened threatened the image that I wanted people to have of me. So, here's what shame is. Shame is a painful feeling of humiliation or distress that's caused by something we did wrong or something that was done to us. It's a feeling that arises from the sense that something is fundamentally wrong about ourselves, and it's oftentimes a reaction to other people's opinion of us. So, whether someone does something wrong to us or if we do something that we perceive to be wrong, if we begin to attach that negative emotion to our sense of being, that is what shame is. For example, if during that sermon where I stumbled over the name of the city, if after that moment I began to say to myself, man, I'm such a failure. I'm a terrible preacher. People will never respect me. They'll never invite me to come speak again because I'm a disappointment. That's what makes shame so toxic, right? Like, I went from a mistake I made to a self-condemnation, right? And that's what shame is. Shame doesn't just attack your behavior, but it goes after your personhood. It says not only that you made a mistake, but shame says you are a mistake. Right. And the unfortunate part of shame and how it works is that for many of us, man, we've had different shame attacks, shame experiences over the course of our lives that we've just tucked deeply away so we don't have to deal with it. And unfortunately, we've stuffed it so much and for so long that oftentimes it takes the smallest things to trigger it to cause us to experience shame all over again. And that is because shame is like an untreated wound. So imagine for a second that you and I are playing around. And while we're playing around, you accidentally smack my hand. It's nothing, right? We're joking around. It's no issue. But imagine for a second that I cut this hand, like I have a deep wound here, a knife wound, and I don't clean it. I don't treat it, but I simply cover it up. I don't even wash it. I just cover it up. Well, in a few days, as you can imagine, that wound would become infected, right? It would start to have pus. It would turn dirty. It would turn a nasty color, and it would be very painful, right? And now imagine for a second that you and I were playing around and once again you accidentally smack that point of pain. What all happened? Well, my reaction to your action or my reaction will be disproportionate to your action, which tells you that you have touched a wound in my life. Well, in the same way, that's what happens with shame when we don't address or we don't deal with any of these unhealthy behaviors or sinful or whatever it is, events that have happened, either things that were done to us or things that we did wrong. When we don't address it, and we may be functioning healthy, but every now and then, someone might say something or do something to you that comes near that source of woundedness in your life, and it'll create a disproportionate reaction to what they did, which is an indication that there is a wound in your life that's not been addressed. You see, shame is an overpowering emotions, and it is the hidden driver behind some of our unhealthy behaviors and unhealthy thought patterns. We might say to ourselves, I don't have shame, that's not an issue. But your reaction, how you react to certain things, might be indicative that you have some buried shame. So let me help you out a little bit with that by sharing with you in this session 10 warning signs that you may be carrying shame. There's a book by Peter Bregan, and in his book, it's called Guilt, Shame, and Anxiety. I got this list, I took an excerpt from his book to share this list with you, but some of these are from his book. So here are some indicators that you might be carrying shame. Number one, when you make a decision about anything, do you constantly worry if people, not whether your decision was good or bad, but when you make a decision, do you constantly worry if people will still like you? If that's a pattern for you, then it might be indicative of you carrying shame. And by the way, one of the keys to identify if this is a shame issue is to ask the question, is it a repetitive pattern? So if any of these 10 are a repetitive pattern in your life, then it's indicative that you're carrying shame. So if you constantly worry if people will like you after the decision, might be sign that you are carrying shame. Number two, when you have strong thoughts or feelings about something, but you don't share them because you're afraid of being embarrassed, that once again might be indicative of shame. Number three, if in a discussion or argument, you always have to have the last word, like you got to one up the person you're speaking with, that oftentimes an indicative of shame because you're not confident in what it is that you're presenting. Number four, if you find yourself, if this is a repetitive pattern where you are in a crowd, whenever you're in a crowd, you're always trying to hide or be inconspicuous. Like, I'm not talking about once in a while when you just want quietness, but if every time you're in a crowd or a group of friends, you're just always trying to hide in the wall or hide behind a plant, that might be indicative of shame, right? This sense of wanting to be hidden away. Number five, if you live with a constant sense of regret, like you just look back on all of your decisions or most of your decisions, and there's this constant sense of regret, shame. Number six, when you're talking to someone, um, and you constantly, instead of maintaining eye contact, you can't maintain eye contact, you got to look away. I mean, there's a healthy balance there, right? You don't want to be staring at someone consistently the whole time you're talking, but if you can barely just keep an eye, maintain eye, or you're constantly looking away, once again, that's an indication of shame in your past. Number seven, if you find that you talk in an overly soft voice, that's not your natural voice, right? Like, or you constantly cover your mouth when you speak, that's indicative of shame. Number eight, if you constantly you're just slump your shoulder instead of standing up, especially when you're around people. If there's this you have this bowed will, so to speak, that might be a sign of shame. Number nine, if you are terrified of failing at something or just looking inappropriate or stupid, you're not even willing to take a risk, that might be a sign of shame. And then lastly, if you constantly have this, you live with a constant sense of self criticism, right? You're constantly criticizing yourself. For example, if a teacher corrects you or gives you criticism, instead of receiving it and learning from it, you start saying things to yourself like, man, I'm such an idiot. Why did I take this course? Like I should just quit. I shouldn't even have tried. Once again, these are all signs that you are carrying shame. So, as you think over this list, and it should be in your workbook, my question for you is this: which of out of these 10, which of these signs have you observed in your life that are indicative of undealt with unexposed shame in your life? Which of them are might you be dealing with? The dark side of shame is that shame thrives in secrecy. Okay. And let's be clear about one thing, and it's this: that Satan, that's the enemy of your soul, wants you to remain in this hidden darkness because, quite honestly, Satan does his best work in darkness. But the key to the healing of your soul, the healing of any wound, any hurt, any shame that that you have experienced, is first and foremost Jesus Christ, clearly. But right next to it is self awareness. Like, you got to be aware that something is wrong, and you have to be aware of what it is that's wrong, right? Like, if you want to release yourself from the stronghold of shame, you're going to need to unpack it. You're going to need to examine it. You're going to need to discover its source. And then, as you get all that information together, you're going to have to prayerfully entrust your self worth into the hands of Jesus Christ. You see, in order for you to live your life and your calling to the full, as Jesus promised in John 10:10, man, you have to be willing to confront the truth about yourself, or you will never rise above your level of self awareness. But if you want to walk in the light as Jesus is in the light, and if you allow the light of Christ to point out those broken areas of your life as you do life together with others, not only will you experience freedom and personal breakthroughs, but you will become a funnel through which, God blesses others. And so this session really was to kind of get you thinking about this, to be honest with yourself about the potential of shame that you've packed away in your life. And so that's our goal this session. Right now, at this time, rather than just rush us off into more content, we're going to take a few moments to prayerfully reflect and respond to a few questions before the next session. And as we've said in the previous weeks, just open your workbook and reflect and respond question for this session, and prayerfully work through these questions, man. And as you do, I'm praying that the Lord Jesus Christ would grant you Holy Spirit filled insight as you begin to unpack any shame issues that you've had to deal with. God bless you. We'll see you in the next session.